The deeper we go into the pool of exclusive Amiga games, the more late releases we get to tackle, and today there's quite a few, so let's check them out together. Ruffian is an always scrolling action platformer and an unusual one at that. Why? Cause while it seemingly was developed in 1994, it wasn't released until 1996. It's hard to tell what's the reason behind such a delay, but it meant that when it finally dropped, there were maybe 7 or 8 Amiga users left overall. And 3 of them were living in a jungle, in a remote location using their A500s as bookends. Perhaps weirdly shaped and huge bookends in a place where there were no books, but bookends nonetheless. I'm obviously exaggerating, everyone knows that there were at least a couple hundred Amiga gamers still left by then. And all of them lived in Poland, Germany and UK. Okay, I gotta stop it, it's neither correct nor getting us anywhere. But the point still stands. 1996 was way too late for an Amiga game to release and make any real impact on the system's gaming scene. Ruffian is composed out of 17 jungle-themed levels, which while scrolling in all 4 directions are actually built to mainly move vertically. Kinda like those in Rainbow Islands do, but on a much larger scale. And your task is to find and locate all pixies in each level and then get to the exit. All naturally within a constantly ticking and unforgiving timer. Little fellas are caught up in carnivorous plants scattered around the levels, and to save them you have to kill the plants by spitting at them with seeds. Like a jungle hoodlum that you are. There are tons of various pickups dotted around the level, stuff like jewels, gold caps, potions and spells, and grabbing them can obviously help you on your adventure. These grant our hero additional powers like higher jump, rapid fire spray, invincibility and quakes to name a few, and are more than helpful in completing the game, especially that it's a buddies galore. And any and all creatures that you'll meet, other than the pixies that is, are all out to get you. Graphically, Ruffian doesn't look too bad, but in the same time it also doesn't look 1996 good either. It's decent, but nothing special. And animation especially could use a bit more work as it feels a bit floaty. In conclusion, Ruffian is an interesting even if unspectacular platformer, and if you like this and don't mind rather unforgiving timer, you'll have quite a lot of fun in this one. There's one thing that makes Super Gems or Gem Z special among all other games in this video. What, you may wonder? Well, unlike every single other game here, Super Gems was never released. In fact, we should not talk about it here because it shouldn't exist. The game's release was cancelled when its source code was stolen from the developers, Keiko, at a computer fair in 1992. So while it's considered a 1992's game, all versions that could be found online now are its stolen bootlegged copies. Today it bears no legal weight really, but it's an interesting little fact about it, don't you think? Story-wise, when Her Majesty's crown jewels were stolen by a master thief, a quartet of heroes was summoned by her to recover them. So they embark on an epic puzzling adventure spanning over 104 increasingly difficult levels. Super Gems is a mixture of Keiko's earlier Gem X and Bomberman, with tons of power-ups and beautiful anime presentation. It also features one of the most unusual approaches to the puzzlers that I've ever seen. Namely, all levels can be completed by either one person or even up to 4 playing cooperatively. And you could say that there's plenty of games that allow for simultaneous 4-player cooperation, but riddle me this. Name one that happens to be a puzzler. Exactly. The strangers are folks you should never have your kid pick up sweets from. You can easily recognize them by their greasy hair, crazy eyes and the fact that they're basically living in their vans, filled with candy and questionable for a grown-up toys. Coincidentally, it is also a side-scrolling beat-em-up on the Amiga that's actually pretty good, and equally as brutal and bloody as Franco or Doman were. Perhaps more. It only ever came out on AGA Amigas using the system's chips to the fullest, but, and it's gonna be a big but, pun intended, it came out in 1997. So same as Ruffian I've spoke about today, a bit too late to make a difference and resurrect the Amiga. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my Amiga, it's the system I have most fond memories of, but let's not kid ourselves. After 1995, the quality and number of games released for it went down dramatically, and few and far between decent titles were not a norm but an exception. The Strangers is basically your Double Dragon / Target Renegade of yore, but with more variety and bucketfuls of blood. Story-wise, in a dystopian near future when the world is rather rundown, plagued by criminality, offers no social security or support system whatsoever, the gangs rule the cities. A notorious mafia boss is in hiding and rules your city with an iron hand. You play as a member of and I shit you not, positive gang that bases all they stand for in being just and good. Yup, a gang. Anyway, you plead to find the mafia boss and end his reign, and you will do it going through 8 rather long and chock full of enemies levels. While the sprites are not overly big, they are presented on a not bad pre-rendered backgrounds, and there can be an impressive number of them on a screen at once, at times even around 8. And in beat-em-ups on Amiga, it usually never went over 4 or 5-ish. So, having so many moving enemies at once is definitely fresh feeling and adding to the atmosphere of going alone against a city of thugs. You are not defenseless on your quest, however, as other than your repertoire of kicks and punches, there are a lot of weapons you get to find, pick up and use. So stuff like knives, chains and hockey clubs will be of immense help to you. As you by now no doubt have noticed already, my saying that the strangers serve gore by the bucket was not an exaggeration, and it actually is incredibly brutal all throughout. There are even finishers that the enemies can pull off on you to decapitate you or kill you in other gruesome ways, Mortal Kombat style. Graphically, strangers are fine, though the animation is a bit stiff, especially all the attacks feel as if they were animated by someone who've never seen a human in motion. But I may be wrong, and it's just a spiritual callback to the aforementioned Target Renegade. In the end, if you enjoy brawlers, this one's definitely worth a look. Venom Wing is a side-scrolling shoot-em-up, and believe it or not, it has a story. Same as in real life, in Venom Wing, you're a veteran combat pilot and one of the best that there ever were actually. Probably the best even. And you've seen it all, hordes of enemies, armies of evil, bases of numerous tyrants, nothing could stop you. But there's one challenge that no one have ever lived to complete and go through. A challenge that holds supposedly unimaginable riches within. Now, being as experienced and decorated as you are, money means nothing to you. You've plenty enough already. But the challenge of the Fortress network, now that's something you're very much into. The game is composed out of 4 levels, each being one of the 4 fortresses in the network, and each of them is a bit different. Levels 1 and 3 are largely static, keeping you on the same screen at all times and scrolling the background downwards, while levels 2 and 4 are more traditional horizontally scrolling, R-type style. All of them, however, feature a design mixture of sci-fi with organic and a steady onslaught of enemies, mechanical and odd, like flying ice for instance. Each level ends with a boss fight, and these are usually bigger and more intricate than the regular enemies and may require pattern memorization to beat. Unfortunately, where Venom Wing succeeded in novelty, it also fails in power-ups, offering just a few of these. Namely a triple shot, which is exactly what it sounds, a satellite drone, which does what these do in all other shooters, but when played in simultaneous multiplayer, it can actually be controlled by the second player, which is more fun. And finally, a transformation into an eagle, which gives you a temporary invincibility. As you see, there's not many, but perhaps the devs thought that the ingenuity of their design would make up for it. It doesn't. I mean, Venom Wing is not a bad game, I actually find it quite fun, but it's so difficult, man. Even the first level is a challenge to go through. So few extra, preferably more powerful or versatile weapons would be a huge help. If you're a fan of shoot-em-ups though, I don't have to convince you. Venom Wing is definitely worth a playthrough. But if you're on a fence, ask yourself if you enjoy being challenged. And then try it out only if you do. Tyran, which is actually pronounced Tyran, is a late Polish take on Moonstone formula. Now, I don't have to tell you that it's not as good, but what I will tell you is that it's pretty decent actually. I'd say it's in the front half of the average, not quite good yet, but definitely not an absolute stinker. Unlike Moonstone, however, it is single player only and in Polish. First made it virtually a single playthrough game, and second reduced its potential pool of players in 1996 from tiny to nearly non-existent. So yeah, congrats to the dev on their efforts. Anyway, the goal of the game is to defeat the titular Tyran. To do so, however, you have to find, secure and bring 3 magical items to the altar. These are an hourglass, a magic map and a book of birth, whatever that may be. So, same as in the original, for the most part you'll wandering around the map, entering lairs where the enemies are and then teaching them not to breathe anymore, usually with a sword as your prime educational assistant. These locations are marked with color that represent their difficulty level and by extension of that, how many enemies can you expect to find there. Defeating the enemies rewards items, losing costs you gold. Both you and the enemies are described by series of statistics of energy, strength, stamina, resistance and blow. And that last brings few things to mind. None of them kids friendly though, and I'm pretty sure that the devs just made that stat funny sounding unintentionally. Unless one of them was a comedy genius, then yeah, blow it is. During fights you have 7 attacks that you can perform to bring the opponents down to his knees, block and escape, cause you never know. Combat encounters are terrible. They're like Moonstone mixed with Street Fighter, short of special moves, fluidity and fun. And generally speaking, combat feels clunky and annoying, which is not a good sign in a game that bases most of its appeal on it. There are 3 classes that you can pick for your character when starting, and they influence your initial stats and wealth. Other than the lairs, there are also other neutral locations that you can visit, places like the Inn, Mage Tower, Mage Hut, Altar, but you knew of this one already, Nursing Home, Old Mine, Castle, Lake Tower and Forest Tower. There are 6 types of different swords and armor to equip and use, 10 spells and few magical and medicinal items. Tyran had a few interesting ideas, I'll give it that, but it feels like the devs were very fired up when they started working on it and then gradually lost the drive and just pushed through the tears to finish the game. Other than the gameplay, it's most noticeable in the presentation that mixes pre-rendered static images with digitized characters and raster pixel graphics. It looks as if there were 3 different artists working on it, each wanted to do their own thing, and then they put it all together without trying to blend it in any reasonable way. I'm not stupid, I know that it's not the case here, it just feels like it. Correction, I am stupid, but despite that, I know that it's not the case. Anyway, Tyran is an interesting game to check out if you liked Moonstone, and one worth experiencing at least once. Is it worth completing or playing longer? I'm not sure. Personally though, I am not coming back to it. Virocop is a top-down view shooter, not unlike much more well-known Chaos Engine. It is, however, a game released at the very tail end of the Amiga's commercial life, or a year after Commodore went bankrupt, so it's a very polished production both in terms of sound and graphics. Level design is also spectacular, with stages being vast and varying considerably in enemies and bosses alike. Themes of the world that you'll visit shooting your way through hundreds of enemies, leaving none alive behind, will be sports, urban jungle, gods, adventure and Silicon Valley. Same as with other similar titles, you have numerous weapons to choose from and they can be upgraded for even more firepower if you land on these that you enjoy. Nice touch are the end of the world bosses that are all appropriately themed to the areas that they represent, entirely different to one another and all having their individual unique mechanics. Oh, and did I mention that you're a robot named Dave? I mean, who wouldn't want to play as a robot named Dave? Dave the Brave. Because you're gonna be controlling him, so he ain't afraid of no ghost. Anyway, Virocop is quite difficult, its stages are overflowing with enemies, and even though at times it may feel a bit overwhelming, the game's so good that it never even borders on being frustrating. The addition of simultaneous multiplayer mode, where one of the players controls Dave's movement while the other is shooting, is an interesting design choice and a fun concept. Especially that when there's none there with you, it can be used by a single person in a twin-stick Robotron style mode. Virocop is fun, go and play it. T-Zero is a side-view horizontally scrolling shoot-em-up, and it's probably the closest thing Amiga ever got to a bullet hell shooter that I know of, even if it came too late to save the system. At first it may not seem like it, but T-Zero tends to on occasion drop so many enemies at you at once that it's hard to tell what's happening, which some may call a bad game design and others call it a bullet hell. Oh, and since it requires at least a 68030 CPU with 8MB of RAM, it never slows down and keeps the frantic pace regardless of what's going on the screen. And there's usually a lot. There's quite a few weapons to choose from or pick up really in the form of power-ups, but when you find what you like, what you work best with, it's better not to go for anything else, as picking a wrong one will not only switch to it, but also serve it to you at the lowest possible level of power. It's also something to keep an eye for, cause these power-ups can cluster in one spot, and there can be more than one occupying the same few pixels on the screen. There are 3 different ships to choose from, and each level has 2 possible routes you can take to complete it. T-Zero is an amazing shooter. That's not only a very late addition to Amiga's library, but also one that came with a hefty spec requirements. So, unless you own a very powerful Amiga, which is anything but affordable today, you'll have to run it through emulation, which I consider to be the best way to play the system today anyway. But I know that some purists would never go for it. Oh, and it goes without saying that you should definitely try it out. And when you're done with all the stages, you can even design some of your own with an included level editor, which is just a cherry on top of this already sweet pie of a game. Games like Transplant make me wonder how names for the games back in the day were conceived. I mean, it's a space shooter that feels like a mix of Asteroids and any other generic sci-fi shoot-em-up, and yet the devs decided that Transplant was the name for it. I mean, there's gotta be a reason, right? Maybe because it's a concoction of ideas transplanted from other games to make this odd and playable mix, or perhaps the devs just sat at the table, wrote all the ideas down, threw them in a hat and pulled the first one out. I suppose we'll never know. One way or another, Transplant is an arcade shooter in top-down 360 degrees viewpoint, where you're free to fly around the map destroying rocks and various enemies. When all objects in a particular level are destroyed, you move to the next one. Since the movement is free, it may have been tough to locate that last small enemy hidden somewhere in the corner of the map, so you have a radar. But unlike other games in a genre, it's not a rectangle on the side or top of the screen, but rather dots surrounding your ship. Each dot represents one target that needs to be cleared, and its distance to your ship corresponds proportionally to the real distance between the two. Transplant starts with 3 lives, and you can upgrade your ship or buy more lives between the levels for money that you earned during battles. Flexibility, power and shields can be raised through said upgrades, and each of them has 5 levels of quality. Rather inventively, Transplant features a very interesting password system. When your last life is lost, you receive a password for that stage, and when you restart from that point, you not only have a full set of lives, but also all your upgrades has been sold off, and you're left with the monetary equivalent to upgrade your ship. This time perhaps with another combination of those parts to not fail again. If you like shooters, check Transplant out, it's really fun. Virtual karting is a proof that by 1995 Amiga still could, if the devs only wanted it to. But what could it do? Well, offer smoothly playing and using modern technologies racing game for its time at least. Unfortunately, as it came out, it only proved to be a concept that it never fulfilled. It features only 3 rather boring and entirely flat tracks, no multiplayer mode, and the AI is trash, serving more as an obstacle to overcome rather than the competitor to race against. Sure, you get to see the track overview before racing on it, to familiarize yourself with all the turns, but it hardly saves the game from being another boring and bland racer. And the graphics? I mean, some will probably praise them for being full 3D and textured mapped, but to me they look like jumbled mess of washed out colors and dithering galore. I think it's clear by now that I don't like it. And I'd rather play nearly any other racer on the Ami, like Lotus 2 for instance. But despite me not having a lot of good to say about it, I have to give it credit where it's due. And virtual karting, on its minimum requirement, 8/1200, runs very smoothly. And the handling is pretty good when you get used to it. When you finally do, you'll realize quickly that you went through all the tracks that it had to offer, and there's hardly any incentive to keep playing. Whether you want to give it your time, it's your call, I wouldn't. For all intents and purposes, Zeewolf 2 Wild Justice is a 3D helicopter shooter. It is not, however, one of those extremely hectic shooters where there are thousands of enemies charging at you from all sides, but one that's considerably slower and more strategic, especially because each mission has its own set of objectives and controls require practice and getting used to. But when you do, it's a blast to play, apparently. Zeewolf 2's missions range from simple search and destroy ops to protection of tank groups, and the game can be controlled either by joystick or a mouse. There are a few kinds of weapons available to lay destruction on the enemy forces, and both weapons and fuel are finite, so refueling and purchasing of additional armament may be necessary mid-mission on some of those longer assignments. Zeewolf 2 was made with all Amigas in mind, so the 3D untextured shadowed viewpoint is kept at a very limited size to hold acceptable framerate on all possible configurations. Naturally, basic A500 and 600 are hardly beasts to give it a lot to work with, but it can be said that Zeewolf 2 is unplayable on them. Back in the day, Zeewolf's graphics were considered very good, innovative even. Today, they're fugly at best. But such is life. As much as 2D graphics hold the quality and look pleasantly for decades, like a fine wine, early 3D games age terribly and just look awful. Gameplay-wise, Lemon Amiga users seem to love the game and praise its quality and fun factor. Personally, I didn't dig it too much, as I only had an A500 and it felt too slow for me. So, it's another one of those games you best make your own mind about it. Now, what do you think of today's selection of exes? Good or no? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. Smash them if you have to, it helps more than you could ever know. Also, I would like to thank you and all my amazing Patreon and YouTube members for helping this channel keep going. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank all the wonderful folks who record and upload playthroughs, let's plays and other retro-centric videos here on YouTube, because they help to preserve the games that would have otherwise been long forgotten. So thank you.